Do either of you happen to know why it happens to be Maryland in particular that ends up
Well, that's a
party in the
that's
case?
yeah, that's a great question. I know the Maryland branch under McCulloch was very aggressive in loaning and engaged in a variety of speculative endeavors. And so it may be that their activity was so pronounced that it prompted the Maryland legislature to hit them with that tax.
Wow. But it was
That leads to the case. Go ahead.
but
I'm
it
sorry.
but it was a state. Almost all the states had become
Yes.
aggressive in this. Okay,
Oh,
that's
that's
very
right. I mean, the states were
really
very energized, especially in the South, because you have the fall of the price of cotton that and the fall of land values. I mean, they're markedly because they're so, as you know, they're so the entire economy of the South is increasingly based on this one cash crop. So when it goes sour, everything else goes sour, and so they were especially vociferous in their attacks on the bank. I mean, it's John Marshall actually says that he thinks the Bank of the United States produces the formation of political parties. It's the one issue, as early as the 1790s. It's the one issue it's so contentious that the first party system, Marshall attributes it largely to the bank. I think there's some measure of truth in that. I mean, the bank becomes so controversial, it roils American politics until Jackson finally puts a stake through it, after 1833, with the removal of the deposits.
right. Right.
Let me
So
just say one more thing. I didn't mean to
please.
dominate the time, but one more thing I would say is I think the bank was a very constructive institution for a developing economy because it provided a stable currency, and all kinds of helpful financial assistance to the nascent federal government. So I think the bank was actually overall a good thing, but it was difficult to explain. It was difficult to explain to people when the bank had to cover itself because of its excessive loans. It was easy to demagogue it. It was easy to see it as a villain. And it has to be said too that the bank's management often did stupid things or unethical things. Got involved in politics, made loans based on personal relationships, all the things that you're not supposed to do in an institution like that. So it was often its own worst enemy.
Very interesting. So was the bank so among the populace, the bank was generally unpopular. Is that a fair statement or not?
No, I think that's true. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, and it has to be said too that the emerging Jacksonian Democratic Party had a kind of, they embraced the agrarian ideal, and they really had a kind of stunted view of what banking and what banks could do. If you look at Andrew Jackson's ideals, for example, well, he had a bad experience early in his career with banknotes where he had been paid for some kind of service by banknotes from a state bank, and then the bank went belly up, and so Jackson was left holding worthless paper, which was not an unusual experience in this time. Well, after that, as far as Jackson was concerned, every bank was a kind of swindle. Well, he didn't differentiate between, some state bank that forms in Tennessee and is a kind of fly-by-night operation that may in fact be a swindle, and the Bank of the United States that's chartered by the United States government, has board, 5 of its board of directors are appointed by the federal government. I mean, that's a much different entity, than the Bank of something Tennessee. But he couldn't make that make that transition, and so Jackson thought every transaction should be conducted in coin or gold. Well, that certainly would protect the value of whatever goods and services you were selling, but in an emerging economy, there's not enough coin to go around to fuel economic growth. You end up basically with a barter economy, which is a kind of natural curb on economic growth. So the bottom line is Jacksonian economic views were stupid. I mean, it just has to be said. I mean, it was based on a kind of unnatural prejudice associated with banks, and it's really tragic because up until until the Civil after 1833, until the Civil War, you really don't have you've got these state banks providing notes of that wildly fluctuate in value or just disappear. And it really retards, the country was growing anyway, despite that, but, how much better would it have done if you had had a consistent national entity providing a consistent medium of value in the form of a currency to fuel economic growth?
That's very interesting. Hey, Jeremy, Dan's been talking, of course you've been listening, Dan, but since Dan's brought up the sort of the Jacksonian approach to these sorts of things, had the parties, to the extent that there were parties, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, really drawn hard lines in the sand with regard to economic policy and especially with regard to a bank? How did in other words, I guess I'm wondering, how did the parties, in the that they're developing at this time, how were they affected by the bank issue, and how did they affect the bank issue?
Yeah, so I think the way that Dan has laid this out is very helpful, and I don't have any sort of objections. There are just two things that I would add to it to round out the picture. One is a small point, and that is my understanding is on the as far as was Maryland the only one doing this. I believe so. You have state banks, and state banks are issuing banknotes. So you have the Bank of the United States issuing banknotes. You have state banks issuing banknotes. And for a variety of reasons, after 1816, some of the states think that the Bank of the United States has an unfair advantage in issuing its notes. And so in order to give their own state banks a competitive advantage, they put a tax on the banknotes issued by the Bank of the United States. And so I believe that something like 9 states had issued such tax. Now, why is it McCulloch versus Maryland, or what is so it could have been any other state, I think. It just happened to be Maryland, but there are 8 others that I think that they were doing this. More broadly, I guess one difference that Dan and I have in setting this up is I wouldn't characterize the state of the country politically in terms of having a consensus around the American program. In fact, what is happening is at least the way I see it, is after 1816, what we have, commonly called the era of good feelings, is a one-party system, right? The Federalists are gone, and so with the Federalists being gone, you have people like John Quincy Adams who are naturally Federalist, who are in their DNA Federalist, but because they're involved in politics, have to be members of the Republican Party. And so the Republican Party, for the next couple of decades, will, even as it becomes Jackson's political coalition, has to wrestle with what its understanding of these kinds of questions are. And so that the bank is very divisive within the Jeffersonians in Virginia, for example, and Madison has to spend the last 2 decades of his life, in many ways, sorting out the implications of his signing the bank bill in terms of Virginia Republican politics. Of course, Monroe is left holding the bag, and for Monroe, this is a complete fiasco because he has 2 radically different factions in his party with radically different understandings of what the direction of the country is going to be, and then how that direction or those policy questions relate to the Constitution. So there's a policy element and a policy difference, to be sure. There's also what emerges to be as a constitutional difference. And in Monroe's hand, that really the flashpoint becomes internal improvements, not so much the bank, because the bank becomes settled by McCulloch versus Maryland, but it's internal improvements, and that is the question that divides the party in 1824 and opens the door for the rise of Jackson, and the question of Jackson then becomes in many ways the central question in the 1820s with the way that the various political coalitions are forming. And so I would add that. So I wouldn't agree, I think, with Dan about there being a consensus. In fact, I would say that there's a because of the one-party system, the Republican Party or Jefferson's political coalition is trying to figure out how to deal with the implications of this post-war of 1812 national program that Clay and others are supporting.
Yeah, very. Thank you, Jeremy. That's very interesting. And I kind of want to come back to that in a minute, if you don't mind. We're getting a few good questions coming in from participants. One had to do with Dan's comment earlier about the fact that America was already participating in a world economy by 1819 in the aftermath of the War of 1812. I think the question was something about why did we not realize did we not understand the world economy at this point? The politicians, did we not understand it? Was there even a concept of a world economy at this point in the minds of Americans?
Well, I mean, let me just say two things. One is the country is changing from a coastal economy, the kind of pre-war 1812 economy that is somewhat coastal in nature, to a more, and this was the whole point of Clay's American system, of course, to a more national economy that includes, not just, constant trade with Europe from Boston, Charleston, and so on and so forth, but an economy that includes all these new regions coming into cultivation. So that, but I think as far as the question, I think that's absolutely so. I think the politicians recognized that that trade with the world was a very important element of the economy, but they didn't, it was difficult for them to see all the pieces together. And when things happen, you get this kind of, like you do anytime there's a recession or depression, you get this kind of rolling crescendo of events, and when it's happening, it's you see just the trees but not the forest. One thing, land prices start to fall because cotton prices are falling, and the banks state, as Jeremy correctly pointed out, states and the national bank start to call in loans. It becomes all one thing, but at the time it's viewed as these certain discrete events. And let me just say in response to Jeremy, I mean, the passage of the tariff and the passage of the national bank does suggest that there was at least some consensus on these matters, but Jeremy's quite right. I mean, there were lots of people, the so-called old Republicans never accepted any of these things. And John Tyler, who someone wrote a book about, I can't think of the guy's name right now, but but Tyler never.
What's the title of that book?
Yeah, what's the title of that thing? I don't know.
Type it in the chat box.
Yeah, it's a great stocking stuff for Christmas. But at any rate, the point is John Tyler and others never accepted these elements of Clay's system, and always thought the bank. There's a great line in one of Tyler's speeches where he complains in 1816, 1818, in this general time frame. I'm so tired of hearing the term national. Everything's going national. There's even a national oyster house now, in Washington, D.C. So Jeremy's quite right. There's lots of dissension. Lots of people are very uncomfortable with this, the idea of, a kind of the national government getting involved in the economy in the way that Clay advocated.
Very interesting. We're getting some, again, really good questions coming in, and so far some of this discussion has reminded some people of the more recent crises involving banks and lending and things like that. Lori asked about, let's see if I can find her question really quickly. Lori asked about bank regulation. Do we have any kind of bank regulation? Do we have someone keeping an eye on it or making sure they follow the rules? So I guess maybe could either of you or both of you say something in general about the kind of banks that they're actually creating? So we have the first bank, we have the second bank, and then there's the attempt to establish the third bank. What were the banks going to be like? And I ask this in part maybe as a way to get into the question: what about the banks? Maybe on a higher political level, were people really not fond of? So we can talk about Jackson's reasons for objecting and those sorts of things. How national? Dan, in light of what you were just saying, today, national means something. National is everything today in popular parlance, for better or worse. But how national were these really, even by today's standards?
Well, it's not Chase Manhattan. There's not, they're not issuing credit cards that are ubiquitous everywhere now. But after all, the Second Bank of the United States did establish during this speculative fever. I think they had a branch in virtually every state. They were very aggressive. The whole idea was to create a kind of stable currency that would, and also make loans to state banks that would provide them with some degree of stability as well. But as Jeremy correctly pointed out, state banks are issuing currency and they fluctuate in value. I mean, there's really no regulatory check in the modern sense over the Bank of the United States. That there's congressional committees that investigate it, and indeed the bank did engage in practices. I mean, the Baltimore branch, for example, which McCulloch was involved in, engaged in some terrifically unethical acts, and the bank justifiably was criticized for privileging some people rather than others. I mean, if you were a friend of the bank, the bank would take care of you. And it has to be noted that under Nicholas Biddle, who replaced Jones, who was the head of the bank in the period that we're talking about this morning, the bank got involved in a very naked way in politics. I mean, Biddle came up with $100,000 and put it behind Clay in the 32 election. So, it has to be said. I mean, I made some remarks earlier. I do think the bank overall was a constructive institution in this period. And frankly, I think it would have been better had it continued rather than had a stake put through its heart by Jackson. But having said that, there's really no oversight other than the Congress. And it is vigorously investigated by congressional committees periodically and subjected to criticism. But it's not like there's an SEC, to keep an eye on it. Yeah. And the result is it does engage in some unethical activities really throughout its existence.
Yeah, I think that's all very clarifying. And I was wondering. So first of all, with the point that Dan just made about Biddle putting $100,000 into the 1832 election, the first question I always ask myself about that is well, how much is that in today's money? It's got to be a ton of money. But second of all, in terms of if we were to have a pie chart of the money spent on the 1832 election, it would have to far, in terms of a proportion of influence, outweigh the kinds of things that we see from the Koch brothers or Sheldon Adelson or Soros in today's campaign finance world. So that was a big deal. I would push that concern back all the way to the beginning. As a policy matter, and this is not the constitutional stuff so much, which we should talk about, but as a policy matter, Jefferson and Madison's objections really can't be separated out from the fact they thought that Hamilton was using the bank to reward his friends. That this was really, and they were probably right, and it matters that it was part of a scheme, the Assumption Plan, the Report on Manufacturers, which were both explicitly on their face would reward certain people, and those certain people happen to be guys like Hamilton. And so there's the stench of corruption, if not corruption itself, was always around the bank. And so this is something that Jackson picks up on, later. But it goes all the way back to the very beginning, to the sparkle in Hamilton's eye. That is that Hamilton's critics believe that Hamilton's friends are profiting from this plan.
And it's got to be tied too, Jeremy, I would think, to just a general disagreement between Madison and Jefferson on one hand and Hamilton on the other, of their vision, the sort of vision of the economic future of the United States and how that will impact not just social life but political life. So Hamilton's got all these plans for supporting manufacturing and more vigorous national program in general toward the economy. Mm-hmm. And we know, and maybe you can speak a little bit about this if you don't mind. We know that politically, Madison and Jefferson distrusted Hamilton because he was more, how did they put it? He was described as what they call him, a monocrat, I think. Politically, Hamilton was inclined toward a stronger national government at the expense of what Madison and Jefferson understood to be the more essential forms of republicanism. So can you talk a little bit about how the political disagreements between Jefferson and Madison on the one hand and Hamilton on the other affected or shaped the debate in the 1790s over the national bank?
Yeah. So just I'll say something broadly in a second, but on one specific. On the report on manufacturing, it is true that Jefferson and Madison objected to the kind of nation that Hamilton envisioned, and that is that there would be this a reliance on domestic manufacturing. Jefferson famously thought that this was a bad idea. It would produce an economic climate in which people were dependent on things like markets. To be dependent on something was to be a slave to something. So to the extent that I'm dependent on some sort of market for something makes me less independent as a person, and less independence is bad. That's the basic logic. There's also something more direct than that, and that is that on its face, the manufacturing report would pick winners and losers. That was the whole point, is that the government was going to be in the business of encouraging manufacturing, and that means it was going to be in the business of picking winners and losers. Hamilton had a grand scheme for this, prizes and bounties and subsidies that he lays out. And so there's a kind of debate here about that. And the most important thing to remember there is that Hamilton is not a free market person. This is not Adam Smith come to America. This is a completely different vision for economic life, and that vision includes somebody like Hamilton, somebody in the national government with their finger on the scales in order to guide the national economy. This is not Adam Smith's invisible hand. If anything, that's closer to the Jefferson position. Now stepping back to the more broad point, and that is when we talk about Jefferson and Madison, it's important to acknowledge, I think, some differences between the two. And the most interesting difference, which we can tease out maybe, is that Madison was actually for the bank before he was against it. That's
right. I know.
Yeah, he was for the bank before he was against it, and then he was for the bank after he was against it.
Right.
So he moved several times on the bank, and so his signing, the bank bill, which he tried to justify throughout his life, and that's an interesting thing in itself. Is a deviation, but it's not a deviation from his position in the late 1780s. Madison is the person at the convention who proposes the power to incorporate a national bank, and it's rejected at the convention.
That's right.
And so it's an interesting question about, in terms of the policy matter, the extent to which Jefferson and Madison agreed. They both agreed that Hamilton should not have a bank in his hands. Whether or not in the abstract a bank was a good thing for public policy, I suspect that Jefferson and Madison probably disagreed about that. Now they agreed on the constitutional merits of the question, but
that's fascinating. You're right. So by the way, yeah, Madison was in favor of not just incorporating banks, but I think he called for the ability for internal improvements, a national university, and other things at the convention, Jeremy, as you mentioned, that were all vetoed. So this then leads to another question that's a couple of good questions that have been submitted, actually. One of them having to do specifically with your point about Madison was for it before he was against it, and for it after he was against it. So I'd like to talk about Madison's how do we think about Madison himself in the late 1780s, then into the 1790s, and then as president with regard to the bank. One question of clarification, though. Larry submitted a question about Hamilton, since I think one of you mentioned the corruption in the assumption plan. Larry says he's read that there's been corruption. There was corruption in the assumption plan and in the beginning of the bank, and Hamilton accepted this as, quote, the price of doing business. But can we say something about Hamilton personally? We're not saying that Hamilton himself was corrupt, or how do we think about Hamilton? How do you take a Hamilton who says I can live with the corruption? I know this is often related to the British system that he was fond of.
Yeah, no, I think this is maybe thinking on my feet. This is akin to the doctrine of collateral damage. That it's an unpleasant fact of creating good government. That it's going to have this stuff, and you need to attract people who are going to invest and attach their reputations to government, and and their interest, the government, in order that has to be in their interest, and so there's going to be some collateral damage in terms of ethics, some ethical collateral damage. That doesn't bother Hamilton all that much. I don't think he's personally dipping his hand into the bucket. I don't think that's just what he was interested in. But and in terms of what I mean by the corruption of the assumption case, Hamilton had a very plausible argument for why the government needed to assume the state debts and why you couldn't discriminate between the original holders of the debts and the people, the speculators who bought them, and that's a very sensible argument, and I might even agree with it. The problem is that the fact that at the level of appearance, the people who are benefiting from that deal are investor types who more or less run in the same circles of Hamilton.
Yeah, sorry, I had to find my unmute button. I apologize. Thanks very much.
Let me just can I just chime in on this?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add a bit to Jeremy's point that he made about Hamiltonian interest. The First National Bank, the bank's involvement in corruption, the First National Bank, the board of directors included many influential members of Congress. I mean, they weren't stupid. They immediately, plugged in key members of Congress to the board of directors, who then got all kinds of perks, from the First National Bank. So this, this question of corruption and Hamilton's acceptance of it, which I think Jeremy laid out quite well. This would be something that Hamilton would say, well, this is what we have to do. It's not doesn't quite pass the smell test, but it is what it is. We've got to get this thing off the ground, and we need it to be supported. So the board of directors did include lots of key figures, and so naturally they supported it in Congress.
Very interesting. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I was looking for another question again from one of our participants. Had to do with Madison. I can't find the question in my list, but Jeremy, Dan, can you talk a little bit more about Madison in particular, because this is one of these things that's hard to explain. Jeremy, you mentioned, I think Madison had to justify his what seemed like reversals on the national bank issue throughout his life. Why was he for it, then against it, and then for it after 1812? Either of you want to speak a little bit more about Madison on this?
I'm going to take a stab at it, since I've just written a book, sort of wrestling with this for quite a while. And the short answer is that if you're looking for perfect consistency here, Madison is not going to satisfy you. And Madison indeed spent the last decade of his life trying to find a way to square the circle. And so I could lay that out. His justification of signing the bank bill, so why he allowed the bank bill, in fact he proposed the law and then signed it, was that his constitutional question had been relieved by the fact that it had undergone lots of debate between all the branches, and that the construction of the Constitution had been settled by that debate. And so that was now sufficient in terms of the meaning of the Constitution, that some clauses in the Constitution aren't going to be perfectly clear. That's just a fact of constitutional life. And so there's going to need to be sort of grand deliberation through a constitutional process, and that process had happened, and clarity emerged. Now, that being said, he never, ever accepted Hamilton's reasoning for the constitutionality of the bank. He never accepted Marshall's reasoning for the constitutionality of the bank. And that there's a distinction there. So just as Jefferson, for example, was okay with Washington's neutrality proclamation, he never accepted Hamilton's constitutional defense of it. And so just because Madison, so that's sort of one point. Now let's go back. I think the more interesting case is Madison's decision to be against the bank in the 1790s, even though he was for it in the 1780s. So that to me, that's the one that has received less attention. And there, I think the best argument is that Madison believed that the Constitution was a very delicate and contingent achievement, and that giving the appearance of pulling a fast one on the opponents to the Constitution would undermine the Constitution. And so even though he proposed the bill for the bank in the convention, he felt like in order to have the Constitution actually work, it had to work as it was understood by the people who proposed it and ratified it. And since he knew better than anyone that history, he felt like he had to be true to that history. Otherwise, the opponents of the Constitution would say, "See, I told you so." They're really trying to pull a fast one on us. And so that I think explains his defense of a Constitution, in this case, with respect to the bank, that he didn't like, that he thought was flawed. And so rather than Hamilton saying, "Look, this is an opportunity to fix that, and let's get the bank back into the Constitution by way of this construction," Madison said, "No, that's dangerous."
Yeah, that's great, because we've just established the Constitution.
Yeah, you can't go changing it when we all know that the bank was voted down. It would be like changing the equality in the Senate, or well, that's more explicit. But there's all sorts of other examples that the Anti-Federalists would just go crazy about.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, because then you're right. I mean, just from the perspective of what we call it, the optics, it looks like Federalists put certain language in there to make it palatable to Anti-Federalists or anti-federal men, if they weren't strictly anti-federalists, people who are suspicious of stronger national government. And then the idea is once we get it ratified, we just do whatever we want with it by a loose liberal construction of the document. That's fantastic, and that reminds me, Jeremy, of Madison's argument. Is it Federalist? Is it 49 or 50, where he's arguing about is that where he's arguing against Jefferson's call for frequent or regular conventions to revise
49.
the Constitution? 49, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, constitutions take time to sort of establish themselves.
Yeah. Now that's consistent with his later position. People don't have to find this to be satisfactory, but there is a kind of consistency with his later position. And the later position is, look, this was settled, and it's better to have a settled Constitution than it is to have an unsettled one.
Very interesting. So Madison is against the bank in the 1790s for reasons which I think are now much clearer in my mind, Jeremy. Thank you. What affected let's talk about why Madison ended up approving the Second National Bank then. And in particular, what effect did the War of 1812 have, perhaps, on Madison's decision? In addition to what you were just saying, Jeremy, he had by this point we've had the Constitution for 20 years. It's established. I'm wondering what other kind of political and economic factors may have influenced Madison's decision in the 18 teens.
Well, I'm going to give a short answer, then defer to Dan here. My short answer is that the realities of the war reminded him why banks are convenient for national government.
Okay. Dan, you still there? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's quite right. I think the war had a profound effect on some of these Jeffersonian sensibilities, and lots of Jeffersonians or people with that Jeffersonian agrarian sensibility, were prepared to make some concessions to Federalist policies in the wake of the disaster. I mean, after all, the national capital was burned to the ground. That's usually a sign that the war went poorly. When your national capital is burned to the ground. So yeah, I think Jeremy's exactly right. I think Madison was prepared to tolerate things that he previously may have found obnoxious in the wake of experience. And to me, that's a sign of a healthy political leadership. I mean, of course, you don't want to have a rigid ideologue who, regardless of facts and reality on the ground, adheres to policies that clearly altered. So I think that's a strength. I think we live in an age where I think students, and to a certain extent intellectuals, are anxious to point out every smidgen of perceived hypocrisy on the part of political figures, and in a kind of with the benefit of hindsight. But the reality is I think when political leaders act in response to real events and alter their views, that's a good thing. I don't know if that, depending on how they alter them, I mean, it may be a bad thing, but providing some degree of flexibility, I see as a strength rather than a weakness.
Yeah, it seems like what we call hypocrisy today, back then could have been anyway, what you might call judgment, prudence.
Right. No, exactly.
Statesmanship. You make the best decision possible in light of the consequences and within the limits of the possible. So.
Oh, absolutely. And the post-war of 1812 legislative agenda makes perfect sense in light of the war. Of course, there should have been internal improvements. Of course, you needed a national bank to provide some financial stability when there was financial chaos during the war in the absence of the bank after it expired in 1811. Of course, you should have a tariff that privileges certain industries that are associated with national defense if you're going to be facing more or less, as it seemed at that time, maybe kind of a perpetual challenges from European powers. I mean, it's perfectly rational. Now, of course, it did, as we all know, it did prompt the emergence of opposition. But be that as it may, it makes perfect sense for Madison to endorse these things in the wake of the war experience.
Right. Hey, and Dan, I think you just partially answered a question from Larry about what specifically about not having a bank hindered the country, the economic stability that the bank could afford or could.
Right. I mean, after the bank, it always has to be borne in mind that the bank was the financial agent of the federal government. It's where the tariff money was deposited, and the bank, in effect, acted as the clearinghouse as the government paid its bills. Well, when the bank was gone, those responsibilities were distributed to certain state banks, and you had this chaotic system because state banks, were tended to be, chaotically managed.
Right.
Some were very well managed, others not so well.
Right.
And the result was no kind of central clearinghouse for the federal government to run its war effort. Everything was scattered about. So it led to, really the federal government in the War of 1812, I mean, just has to say, pretty much came close to breaking down. I mean, it ceased to function in a coherent way. It was awful. And everyone, to the political class, the political leadership's credit, they all recognized this. They all got this. At the end of the war, there was a kind of mass chin-pulling session where they all recognized, this really went poorly.
Yeah.
And we need to avoid this again. And so, and John Calhoun, in one of the few acts of value to the country that he performed, John Calhoun kind of lays this all out. Calhoun, to his credit, lays this all out in a speech defending the tariff, and going through the list of all the terrible things that had happened during the course of the War of 1812 and the natural remedies for them. It's just, I think it's made perfect sense that all these things were embraced.
Yeah, I remember also reading, for example, I mean, the broad problems you were just laying out, Dan. I also remember, just simple things, what seemed like simple things, paying soldiers, being able to provide or purchase ammunition and provisions. I mean, it took forever through this chaotic bank state quasi national system. It was just a mess. To the point that people were borrowing to fund the war effort. So.
I would like to add here, just in a way, there's an attempt to sort of maybe shift some of our conversation, in talking about the policy merits of the bank. It seems that we're discussing the issue from the perspective of Hamilton and Marshall to begin with, and it seems to me that there are two sort of big lurking questions in encountering this opinion. One is the historic question. And the historic question is what do Marshall and Hamilton do with the fact that they both know that the provision to delegate a bank or to create a bank was voted down in the convention itself. So what do sensible people make of that fact? How big of a problem is it? The other question is what limiting principle is there in their logic? Does their logic allow for any limited principle with respect to the interpretation of government? And is that a problem? So, for example, Daniel Webster is the one arguing this case for the Supreme Court, the great argument for implied powers. Yet Daniel Webster, for the next 20 years of his life, is going to give exactly the opposite argument against implied powers for Jackson. And so implied powers are okay for Congress, but not implied powers for the executive. And so Daniel Webster is not wholly comfortable with implied powers generally. He's only comfortable if Congress is controlling those implied powers, and that requires a principle. And so what's my question for people encountering this is, so what would be the limiting principle that Hamilton and Marshall have? And is there one? And if there's not a limiting principle, is this thing that they're interpreting still a constitutional behalf of limited government? So there.
Great question. By the way, so I'm glad you're shifting the conversation.
That's fabulous.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That's great.
Because I wanted to move toward the decision itself, McCulloch v. Maryland, McCulloch v. Maryland here a little bit to maybe get into Marshall's reasoning, since you're bringing this up, and maybe how it relates to Hamilton's opinion back in the 1790s. So maybe as a way to get into that, since we started with Madison, maybe to follow this through, we asked people to read this letter to Spencer Roane from Madison on the McCulloch v. Maryland decision. Can anybody say anything about what is Madison's objection to the opinion that Marshall writes in McCulloch v. Maryland? If we know he's not necessarily against, if he no longer believes that all national banks are unconstitutional, is there something specific?
Well, I think it's precisely the concern that I just laid out, that Marshall went too far.
Yeah, that's my hunch.
Yeah, and so there's the seriatim opinion stuff. So why did Marshall depart from seriatim opinion? In other words, each individual justice issuing their own opinion. So Marshall's move to issue opinions of the court was a move to create a clarity about constitutional meaning, and thus enhance the power of the judiciary that, from Madison's perspective here, is artificial. That's a very interesting development that students probably ought to be pointed to. But I think simply that Marshall goes too far. He went out of his way to establish a principle, and the principle itself is suspect.
Interesting. Did Marshall, would Madison and others have thought Marshall engaged in orbita dicta in this? I mean, does he go beyond the question that is presented to the court in opening the door up to, or opening the Constitution up to such expansive judicial review? Maybe that's not. What is it about the case or the opinion in particular? Maybe we can talk about this from Marshall's point of view, and then from the sort of opposing point of view.
I mean, I could chime in. I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me just say this. I think this is kind of just a general comment about Marshall. I think Marshall saw himself as defending the federal government. Again, this is why the context is so important. I mean, you have the whole, this is 1819, the whole country's being roiled by the panic, and the Bank of the United States is under attack in all these states via these taxes placed on its currency. And so I think that Marshall's response, the context kind of explains Marshall's expansiveness and his aggressiveness. I think he saw himself as defending the sovereignty of the federal government against an attack by states that would have had, if permitted, would have effectively turned the country back to the, in his view, the Confederation period. So that's why I think he's so aggressive. It's the context that explains his approach to the decision, and is a very aggressive approach to the decision. His insistence on unanimity and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but the decision, the opinion, has at least two parts. The first part of it has to do with Marshall dealing with that question, right? Can a state tax a national bank branch within the limits of that state? And it seems as though Madison could have just invoked the supremacy clause here and just sort of been done with it. But he goes on, and it's Marshall himself who frames the question before the court, I believe, right? This is right at the beginning of the opinion. The first question made in the cause is, has Congress power to incorporate a bank? Now, I believe Maryland had argued. By the way, it was Luther Martin, wasn't it, arguing on behalf of Maryland?
Yeah.
That's right.
Of the Constitutional Convention, former Attorney General. I believe Maryland made two arguments. One, that given the nature of the Union, the compact under the Constitution, states could, in fact, tax a national bank. And two, the national bank was a national bank, and a national bank, I believe, was unconstitutional. But Marshall says the big question before us at the beginning is, has Congress the power to incorporate a bank? He goes on, he invokes, I think, the supremacy clause to deal with the question of states taxing a national bank branch. But then he gives a lot of time. He devotes a lot of thought or a lot of words to how does he put it? Expounding the Constitution. So maybe can we walk through his argument here a little bit, or explain his reasoning here from a constitutional perspective, Jeremy, perhaps, if you don't mind.
Okay, so there's the bit about the 10th Amendment. So remember that for Jefferson, the foundation of the government is the 10th Amendment. And you might say, well, how can a 10th Amendment, which came along later, be the foundation? Jefferson said, well, it's a principle that animates the entire Constitution, and that's everything not delegated is reserved to the states or the people. And so Marshall deals with that by saying, well, look, this word expressly was removed. And so the original proposal said not all power is not expressly delegated. And so in removing that, the framers of the 10th Amendment assumed that there would be some powers that would be implied. And in making that argument, Marshall knew that he was this is more than just a clever argument, because in fact James Madison is the very person who proposed removing the word expressly for that very reason. That the word expressly would bind the government too much. And so there's a kind of logic there, though. You know, it is again interesting that Marshall would refer to sort of the debates about the 10th Amendment, but not refer to the debates in the Constitution about the bank itself. There's a kind of irony there. Now, we should also point out that back in the debates over Obamacare, I remember in the Republican debates, both my own governor, Rick Perry, and then the governor of Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, both quoted the 10th Amendment. And when they quoted the 10th Amendment, they both included the word expressly, which is an interesting sort of a factual error, because they made the very mistake that Marshall said don't make. Now, the larger principle is this, let the end be legitimate, let the means be plainly adapted to that end, the famous statement. And what the basic logic there is, look, governments are created to do certain things. And this goes straight to Hamilton. Governments are created to do certain things, and once you can agree on the ends of government, the next question is that, and once you can agree to give the government control over that end, and that, in this case, regulating finance, controlling money, et cetera, then the means that are plainly adapted to it, as long as they're not forbidden, are going to be part of the grant of power to the government. Now, Madison would say in response to that, well, if that's the case, if Congress has control over the war power, why do they also have the power to raise armies? And why do they also have the power to do this? Why are those other parts that are adapted to that end also explicitly laid out in the Constitution? So there are other parts in the Constitution where both the ends and the means are clearly laid out. And so it raises a question of why are some means included and others aren't. Doesn't that present a problem for the logic? But back to Marshall, the basic point is, look, governments do certain things, and once you agree on delegating control over a particular end, the means are less important in terms of figuring out whether or not they have been explicitly delegated or not, because they're going to be implicitly delegated. And that derives from the very nature of constitutional government itself, and that is that constitutions have to be broadly written because they have to exist in a world where there are going to be certain exigencies. He references the War of 1812 that are going to get in the way of laws that would be read as a mere kind of statute.
I'm going back a little bit, Jeremy. There's a lot of information there, all of which was very, very useful and interesting. But looking at Marshall's opinion, and you quoted a little bit from this, toward the end of his argument with regard to whether the power to create a national bank is implied because it's a legitimate means to the end of fulfilling those purposes of government. Here's his criteria. Let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, right? There's the reference to there's no expressly in there, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution are constitutional. And that raises all kinds of questions in my mind. On the one hand, he says this at the end of a paragraph where he says, look, we all know that the powers of government are limited. But I have to wonder, does that actually limit the powers of government? Or does it really leave things open-ended? Because how do we know what ends are legitimate? How do we know what the spirit, in addition to the letter of the Constitution, is?
Yeah.
Who determines those things?
Yeah, and I would say so. Look, if Marshall's end is workable government, then his logic is going to win out, right? So if the end is to have a government that works, then this makes sense. But if your end is different, if your end is government by consent of the governed, then it's not so clear that logic works out, because you've got a different goal, and that is to protect the consent that people are giving. So you're going to require utmost clarity about what powers are given or not given.
Right.
But if your end is a workable government, then you're going to follow that logic much more easily.
Yeah, and I suspect that there are Federalist, National Republican, if you want to call them that, but Federalist views of what the legitimate ends of government and what a workable government would be, and then there are Republican understandings of these sorts of things. So, by the way, last week, or 2 weeks ago, we had our first Saturday webinar, and we had a great conversation about Marbury v. Madison and talking about Marshall's opinion in that case. And one of the things that came up was the idea that Marshall and a lot of Federalists knew that politically Federalists had suffered, as you know, a major setback in the election of 1800, and a lot of Federalists viewed the courts as maybe the last bastion of federalism, or the last place where Federalists could have an impact on the future nature and scope of not just the government itself, but the policies, economic and political, that would flow from it. So I guess I'm wondering if either of you can say something about Marshall's political motives, perhaps, in this particular opinion, assuming that he has political motives and isn't simply one of these perfectly unbiased, objective Supreme Court justices that we all hope and wish that we have, but maybe very rarely get. Is it possible Marshall had political motives in this opinion?
Go ahead, Dan.
I mean, I would say that the answer is yes. I mean, I don't think Marshall was working in a vacuum, or in the cone of silence. I mean, he was very aware of what was going on with regard to the conditions of the United States, and the decision is written in the expansive way that it is, in part as an answer to those who were challenging the supremacy of the federal government. I mean, remember the Council for Maryland started by defining the United States as the creation of a sovereign states entering into a compact.
Oh boy!
They go right to the reasoning that's the basis for nullification and secession.
And by the way,
and Marshall responds to that in a very aggressive way, and I'm sure that those who opposed nullification and secession later drew on this opinion, among other things, of course, to respond to that. Marshall stresses the sovereignty of the people, not the states. So just the fact that he would make that point within the opinion suggests his political sensibility. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And that definitional argument, of course, plagues the country for the next 30 years. So absolutely, Marshall was a political animal. I mean, this is the thing about the Supreme Court, of course. these guys are not sitting on Mount Olympus and rendering judgments in a in a nonpartisan way. I mean, they are affected by the world that they live in and their own views of the world that they live in.
That's well put. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left. Can we talk about the consequences of the decision, building on what you were just saying, Dan? What were the economic consequences of Marshall's decision? The political consequences? How does this lead to developments among the parties, leading up to Jackson's veto message, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean,
even in terms of our understanding of the Constitution and perhaps the role of the courts, what are the major consequences of this case?
I mean, I'll just say a few things, because we're running out of time. I'll throw it to Jeremy, and he can wrap up. And I'll just say, Marshall saves the bank from this particular assault, but the debate goes on. And in the Jacksonian orbit, they're not reconciled, obviously, to the bank. And all this does is affirm the desire of Jackson to get his people on the court. He's very intent on that. And makes an effort to put people who agree with their more Jeffersonian philosophy with regard to the bank on the Supreme Court. And indeed, as we all know, the second bank in the United States is immensely controversial during Jackson's term. I mean, Jackson is constantly denouncing it as an institution of privilege. And of course, the election of 1832, it's the main issue around the election has turned, in part because Clay and Nicholas Biddle made it, their raison d'etre for running for the presidency in 32. But I don't think there's any doubt that Jackson's approach to this appointing people to the Supreme Court was driven in part by his desire to respond to these kind of decisions. Now I'll just throw it to Jeremy here.
Yeah. For first, one small point on Marshall's definition that I'm very glad that Dan reminded us of this, that the people created the Constitution. This is one of the things that Madison would have objected to. To Madison's deathbed, Madison insisted that his Federalist 39 was the best word on understanding the federal nature of the Constitution. And in that definition, for Madison, the states created the Constitution. Their state ratifying conventions, more precisely, created the Constitution. And that was a crucial difference between he and Marshall to the very end. The consequences, well, on the one, I'm tempted to say that it confirmed Brutus's fear that when you have a debate about the scope of federal power, that it shows that, surprise, surprise, national judges are going to side with the national government. That's what Brutus worried about, and it seems like Brutus is more or less perceptive on that. Though I would moderate that with pointing out that the emergence of Jackson reminds us that, listen, Jefferson's political coalition more or less dominated the country for the next 100 years. That the 19th century really is the story of Jefferson's political coalition holding on to power in some way. There are some exceptions, the Civil War and the kind of death match between Democrats and Republicans after the Civil War. But really, it is a Jeffersonian century in so many ways. And so, in many ways, Marshall's victory is latent. It's not immediate. I would say it's not until the 20th century where the logic becomes so much more important.
Very interesting. Would you say, Jeremy, that because I've heard this from various scholars, read this, that Marshall either attempted to and perhaps succeeded in establishing the Supreme Court as if not the most powerful and important branch of the national government, at least equal to the other branches. What's the effect? I guess I'm wondering, what's the effect of Marshall's decision in this case on the role of the Supreme Court in our government? Have any thoughts on this?
Well, okay, so to this day, the United States has an independent judiciary that knocks acts of Congress down. that makes the United States more or less the outlier in all of world politics. There are a few exceptions, but this is one of the features of American exceptionalism. Parliamentary supremacy is a much more usual a fact of political life, of democratic political life. And the fact that we have a Supreme Court that is so active in our politics has to be credited to John Marshall. Not wholly credited to John Marshall, but credited substantially to John Marshall, and it's a tremendous achievement and probably almost impossible to overstate.
Very interesting. Thanks. What about, can we say something about Jack? We have just a few minutes left. What about, let's maybe wrap this up, bookend it nicely, I guess, with Jackson here at the end and his particular reasons for opposing the rechartering of the bank, the National Bank, in '32. And in what sense was Jackson's veto message a direct response to Marshall?
Well, I would just say I don't think there's. If you look at the veto message, I don't think there's any doubt that. I guess I would say I don't know that Jackson was necessarily responding in a kind of point-by-point way to this decision and to Marshall in particular, but what Jackson does suggest in a general way is that the Marshall Court got it wrong. You know, that the bank was unconstitutional. It was, and he attacks it on multiple fronts. Not only its constitutionality, but it's in his view, its unethical actions. You know, he goes through a laundry list of all of the bank's sins, and finds it wanting.
Right.
And I do think, you know, I think I am not, and I've said this in other contexts. I think the Jacksonian approach to the economy was terribly flawed. But I do think that Jackson was correct about the bank engaging in activities that quite correctly could be termed corruption. You know, if Nicholas Biddle is appointing people, or, you know, Jones, whoever's the head of the bank, is appointing people who are politicians or influential people and then giving them favorable treatment on loans, well, you know, come on. I mean, that's de facto or de jure corruption. So, you know, his critique has lots of strengths.
Yeah. Now, Karen, a long time ago, had submitted a question on this point you raised earlier, Dan, about Jackson just had a general distrust of banks, both national and state banks. But is Jackson really opposed to any bank, or is he just particularly opposed to this bank that he vetoes? Doesn't Jackson suggest either in his veto message or in letters that had he consulted with, or had Congress consulted with him, he could have made recommendations for that to them?
Well, that's what that's quite right. I mean, that's what he says, and there may be some element of truth to that. I mean, who knows? I mean, he ended up vetoing it and exercising all of his distaste for the bank, and it may well have been driven by, you know, Jackson was a very partisan man and took every political dispute personally, as we all know. So the fact that Clay and Biddle moved against him and used the bank as a vehicle to do that really, you know, excited his anger and his distrust. Yeah. But he does show, I mean, you're quite right, Chris. He does show some flexibility early in his first term about the bank. And I think if Clay and his partisans had been willing to work with him, maybe he would have accepted some kind of a bank that was less the kind of muscular thing that Clay preferred. I mean, Jackson's bank would have been some kind of somewhat truncated in the capital that the government provided, and then the flexibility that the president of the bank had to appoint the board of directors and things like. You know, Jackson wouldn't have accepted the kind of muscular bank that it was. He would have put limitations on it. But there is some suggestion. I mean, you're quite right. It's a very perceptive read on Jackson's letters and early messages. He suggests some flexibility, but then in the end, he you know, I think his prejudice is ruled, perhaps in part because of the partisan way that the bank was being used. Oh, I mean, as Jeremy pointed out, $100,000 in the 1832 campaign was a hell of a lot of money. You know, that by the standards of the time, that Bill was dumping into the Clay campaign.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, and again in Jackson's veto message, he mentions at the beginning that he finds this particular bank, unconstitutional. But his main arguments are it undermines states, it undermines the rights of the states. Um, it opens the door to corruption, as we've mentioned earlier, right? A few men will get rich, and it also opens the door to foreign influence, which we didn't really touch on too much. But those seem to me more pragmatic or prudential arguments. Some of them, practical arguments than they are, or economic arguments more than they are even constitutional arguments. But
Well, it has to be said that the foreign investors in the bank were not allowed to vote on issue. They were prohibited by the charter from having any kind of influence on the bank beyond their investment. So some of that was, I think, some of that Jacksonian concern with foreign involvement of the bank was simply a way to appeal to the masses. It was an easy issue to get some juice out of if you waved the foreign menace, in front of in this time. And so one of the people just chimed in on the chat line. Was there a lot of concern in Jackson's day of foreign influence? Absolutely. Yeah. After all, the United States has just fought a second war with the British in recent memory in everyone's lifetime. So some of that, I think, some of the concern of foreign interest was simply to play to the galleries, because they really didn't have any real power. And as proponents of the banks argued, why shouldn't we take the money of Brits and French investors?
Right.
Of course we should.
Yeah. Very good. Well, does this affect? One last question. We're a little bit over, but we started a few minutes late, so I appreciate both of you sticking around for a few extra minutes. Does this effectively kill the idea of a bank? I mean, officially, there is no bank after this, right? I'm just wondering if I usually get questions from people. What is this series of arguments over a national bank? What effect does it have ultimately on the decision to create a Federal Reserve system, instead of a national banking system? Is there any connection, or is that too big of a question to end with here with 1 minute left?
I can't answer that question though. I'll repeat the one thing that I learned from Landy and Milkus, and that is the bank acted like what we call the reserve in the sense that it's setting a kind of monetary policy, but it's also issuing loans and making money. And so in that sense, it was acting both like a private bank and like a financial policy maker, which would open up the doors for influence. The specific connection to post Jackson and onto the 20th century, I can't lay that out.
Probably too big. Sorry for raising it.
No, and I think that's right. I think there's so much time has passed between the Jackson killing the national bank, second national bank, and Federal Reserve. It's hard to make a connection. But it should be said, though. I think it can be said that Jackson doomed the bank for 30 years. I mean, there's nothing comparable until the Lincoln administration and Civil War. Right. And he pretty much put a stake through its heart. Mm-hmm. And I think it was a bad thing. I mean, I really think the developing economy needs that kind of financial stability that the bank could provide.
Very interesting. Well, I want to thank you both again very much for being here this morning, and especially for sticking around after our technical troubles at the beginning. A lot of great information came out from this conversation, and I have more to think about. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It's great to be with you and Jeremy.
Really nice. Thank you.
Good. And thanks to our panel, our participants for some great questions. Just a reminder, you'll get an email with a link for a certificate of participation. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, this is kind of how we do things pretty much in our master's courses. So if you're interested in an online graduate course, take a look at what we offer through our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can find out more about that at tah.org. Our next Saturday webinar will be October 15th. It'll be on Dred Scott v. Sanford, and we'll be joined by Lucas Morell of Washington and Lee University and Jonathan White of Christopher Newport University. So hope to see you all then. Until then, take care. Thanks.